Good evening and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications because here we don't just follow the headlines. We try to understand the deeper forces shaping the decisions of the most powerful people on Earth. Now, something unusual is happening in Washington. Something that most people are misreading. Donald Trump, the man who built his entire political identity around strength, around pressure, around never blinking first, is suddenly talking about negotiations with China, with Iran, even signaling flexibility on Ukraine. And the question that everyone is asking on the surface is why now? But that is actually the wrong question because the real question, the one that reveals something much deeper, is what changed, not in Trump, not in his personality, not in his style, but in the situation around him because Trump does not change his instincts. What changes is his reading of what those instincts require. And right now, something in that reading has shifted. And when you understand what shifted, the entire picture looks completely different. Now, to understand this moment, we need to go back to the beginning. Not to 2024, not even to 2020, we need to go back to the core logic of how Donald Trump thinks about power because Trump does not think in ideological terms the way most politicians do. He does not think in terms of alliances or institutions or long-term diplomatic frameworks. He thinks in terms of leverage. Who has it? Who needs it? Who is pretending to have it? And who is bluffing? This is the lens through which every decision he makes must be understood. And when you apply that lens to what is happening right now, the story becomes very clear. Trump entered his second term with a specific theory, that America had been taken advantage of, that its partners were freeloading, that its rivals were exploiting its openness, and that the solution was pressure, tariffs, sanctions, threats, withdrawal. The idea was simple. Make the cost of dealing badly with America so high that everyone would come back to the table on American terms. And for a moment it looked like it might work. Markets responded. Countries called. Negotiations opened. But then something happened that Trump did not fully anticipate. The pressure did not produce the quick submission he expected. Instead, it produced resistance. And that resistance revealed something important, that the world had changed more than his theory accounted for. Now, consider China because China is the central piece of this story. When Trump launched his tariff campaign against China, the expectation in Washington was that China would feel the pain quickly and come back asking for relief. And China did question if they'll pay. There is no question about that, but China also had something it did not have in 2018 during the first trade war. It had preparation. It had diversification. It had spent years reducing its dependency on American markets, building alternative supply chains, strengthening domestic consumption, deepening ties with other regions. So, when the pressure came, China absorbed it differently. It did not fold. It retaliated. It restricted rare earth exports. It diversified away from American financial instruments. It signaled very clearly that it was prepared for a long confrontation. And this changed the calculation inside Washington in a way that most commentators are not fully explaining. Because here is what the markets were telling Washington. Here is what the economic data was beginning to show. The tariffs were not just hurting China. They were hurting American consumers. They were raising prices. They were disrupting supply chains that American companies had spent decades building. They were creating uncertainty that was making businesses pull back on investment. And in a political system where economic confidence is directly tied to approval ratings, that uncertainty becomes a political problem very quickly. Now, think about what Trump was seeing. He was seeing the stock market behave in ways that made his allies nervous. He was seeing major American companies quietly lobbying against the tariff strategy. He was seeing bond markets send signals that were uncomfortable. And he was seeing China not break, not collapse, not come running, but instead position itself for a longer game. And when a pressure strategy does not produce the expected result in the expected time frame, even the most committed strategist has to consider an adjustment. Not because they have abandoned the goal, but because the path to the goal needs to change. Now, this is where the negotiation signal becomes understandable because Trump did not wake up one morning and decide he liked China or trusted Iran or felt generous toward his rivals. That is not what happened. What happened is that his leverage calculation changed. he realized that maximum pressure without a negotiation exit is not a strategy. It is a trap because if maximum pressure and your opponent does not submit and you have no off-ramp, you are stuck. You either escalate beyond what is sustainable or you absorb the cost of a stalemate, and neither of those options is good for someone who needs to show results. So, the negotiation signal is not a retreat, it is a recalibration. It is Trump creating the conditions for a deal that he can present as a win. Because for Trump, the deal itself matters less than the narrative around the deal. And this is a crucial distinction. He does not need China to fully surrender. He needs a headline that says he won. And to get that headline, he needs a negotiation. Now, let us look at Iran because the Iran dimension of this story is equally revealing and perhaps even more strategically significant. Trump has always maintained that the 2015 nuclear deal was the worst deal in history, that it was weak, that it gave Iran too much. And when he withdrew from it in 2018, he promised that his maximum pressure campaign would force Iran into a better deal, one that was stronger, more comprehensive, more permanent. That was 7 years ago. Iran today has more advanced centrifuges than it did in 2018. It is enriching uranium at higher levels than it was before the pressure began. It has deepened its relationships with Russia and China. It has expanded its regional influence through its network of proxy forces. And the maximum pressure strategy, while causing real economic pain inside Iran, did not produce the collapse or the capitulation that was promised. So, now Trump is signaling openness to negotiations again. And again, the question is why now? And again, the answer is the same. The current path is not delivering the result fast enough. And a deal, even an imperfect one, is more useful than a prolonged stalemate that makes American policy look ineffective. But there is something even deeper happening here, something that goes beyond the tactical calculation of any single negotiation, because what we are actually witnessing is a much larger shift in the global balance of power, one that is forcing the United States to adjust its approach not just on China or Iran, but across the entire international system. And to understand this shift, we need to think about what has changed in the world over the last decade, because the world that Trump is operating in today is fundamentally different from the world that American foreign policy was designed for. For decades, American power rested on a specific set of advantages: military dominance that was unquestioned, economic size that was unrivaled, dollar dominance that made American financial power almost impossible to challenge, alliance networks that covered Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, and technological leadership that kept America at the frontier of every major innovation. These advantages were real, they were significant, and they gave the United States a degree of leverage that no country in history had ever possessed. But here is the thing about structural advantages. They are not permanent. They erode slowly at first, then faster. And the erosion of American structural advantage is now reaching a point where it is visibly affecting strategic options. Now, consider the dollar. The dollar's role as the global reserve currency is the foundation of American financial power. It allows the United States to run deficits that would be catastrophic for any other country. It gives Washington the ability to use financial sanctions as a weapon without destroying its own economy. It creates demand for American assets that keeps interest rates lower than they would otherwise be. But the dollar's dominance is being quietly challenged. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but consistently. Countries that have been sanctioned by the United States have been forced to develop alternatives. Russia moved significant portions of its trade into non-dollar currencies after 2022. China has been systematically building the infrastructure for yuan-based trade. The BRICS grouping has been discussing alternative payment systems. And while the dollar remains dominant, the trend line is moving in a direction that should concern any long-term American strategist. And Trump, whatever his flaws, reads trend lines in business terms. And a weakening trend line is a reason to make deals while you still have maximum leverage. Now, consider the technology dimension, because this is where the competition is most intense and most consequential. The United States launched a major campaign to restrict China's access to advanced semiconductors. The logic was clear. If you can limit a rival's access to the most critical technology of the modern era, you limit their ability to compete in artificial intelligence, in advanced military systems, in the next generation of economic development. and this was a serious strategic move. But China responded in a way that surprised many analysts. Instead of being stopped by the restrictions, it accelerated its domestic semiconductor development. It poured enormous resources into building its own chip industry. And while it has not yet matched the most advanced American and allied chips, it has made progress that was faster than most experts predicted. And more importantly, it has demonstrated the political will and the industrial capacity to keep going. Which means the technology, pressure like the tariff pressure, did not produce the quick result it was designed to produce. And so again, the question becomes, what is the alternative path? Now, think about the alliance dimension, because this is perhaps the most underappreciated part of the current story. Because what Trump's pressure strategy has done is not just create tension with rivals, it has created tension with allies. Europe has been deeply uncomfortable with the tariff approach. Countries that have been America's closest partners for 22 generations have found themselves suddenly subject to the same economic pressure as adversaries. And this has done something very significant. It has pushed some of those allies to begin thinking about their own strategic autonomy, about whether they need to be less dependent on American security guarantees, about whether they should develop independent capabilities and independent relationships. And when allies start thinking that way, the foundation of American global influence begins to shift. Because American power was never just about military strength. It was about the network, the alliances, the partnerships, the shared frameworks. And if that network starts to fray, the leverage that comes from it starts to diminish. Now, here is the insight that brings all of this together. Trump is reading the situation, and what he is reading is that the window for American leverage is not infinite. That if deals are going to be made, they need to be made now while American power is still sufficient to define the terms. Because the longer this plays out, the more the other side consolidates its position, the more alternatives develop, the more the leverage shifts. And Trump, the deal maker, understands instinctively that the best time to close a deal is when you still have maximum negotiating power, not when you have already waited too long. So, the sudden interest in negotiations is not weakness. It is not a change of heart. It is a recognition that the clock is running, that the optimal moment for a deal is now or soon, and that a deal achieved now is better than a prolonged confrontation that ends with less favorable terms later. Now, consider what this means for the structure of the negotiations themselves. Because Trump does not want a multilateral process. He does not want a long diplomatic framework with committees and working groups and years of talks. He wants direct deals. Bilateral, transactional, defined in terms of clear wins and clear losses. This is both his strength and his limitation. The strength is that it creates speed, it cuts through bureaucratic process, it allows for bold moves that traditional diplomacy would never make. The limitation is that it oversimplifies genuinely complex situations. The issues between America and China are not just about trade balances. They are about technology, about Taiwan, about military positioning, about the global financial architecture. You cannot solve those with a single deal. But Trump will try to define a narrow set of deliverables that he can frame as a historic achievement. And whether that actually resolves the underlying tensions is a separate question from whether it produces a political headline. Now, think about China got his position in these negotiations because China is not entering this with desperation. It is entering with patience. China's leadership has a much longer time horizon than American political cycles allow. Xi Jinping does not face an election in 2 years. He does not need a deal to defend in front of voters. He can wait, he can absorb pain, he can let the situation develop. And this asymmetry in time horizons is actually one of the most important factors in how these negotiations will unfold. Because Trump needs a deal that looks like a win before the political costs of the economic disruption become too significant. China knows this, and China will use that knowledge to extract concessions while appearing to be flexible. This is the art of negotiation from a position of patience. You let the other side feel the urgency, you respond slowly, you signal flexibility on small things while holding firm on the things that actually matter. And in the end, you get more than the pressure campaign was designed to give you. Now, consider Iran in the same framework. Iran is also negotiating from a position that is more complex than it appears. It is under significant economic pressure. Its currency has weakened. Its population is frustrated. The economic costs of sanctions are real and serious. But Iran also knows something important, that the United States has limited appetite for military escalation in the Middle East. That any military action against Iran would have consequences that are difficult to control. That the regional architecture has shifted in ways that make the cost of confrontation much higher than it was a decade ago. So Iran can negotiate without appearing desperate. It can signal openness while maintaining its core positions. And it can use the negotiation process itself as a way to gain time, to reduce pressure, and to improve its position without making the fundamental concessions that Washington says it wants. Now, bring all of this together, because what we are actually looking at is not a story about a Trump changing his mind. It is a story about the limits of unilateral pressure in a world that has become genuinely multipolar. The pressure strategy was designed for a world where America's rivals had few alternatives, where its allies were fully dependent, where the dollar was unchallengeable, where technology gaps were insurmountable. That world no longer fully exists. It has been replaced by a more complex system where rivals have developed resilience, where allies are questioning dependence, where alternatives to dollar dominance are slowly developing, where technology competition is genuine and intense. And in that world, the pressure negotiation strategy runs into a fundamental problem. It assumes a degree of dominance that is no longer quite as absolute as it once was. Now, think about what this means for the future, because the negotiations that are beginning now will not resolve the fundamental competition between the United States and China. They will not permanently solve the Iranian nuclear question. They will not settle the deeper questions about how the world is organized. What they will do is create a temporary pause, a moment of reduced tension, a transactional arrangement that gives both sides something to point to, and then the deeper competition will continue because the forces driving that competition are structural. They are not about the personality of any single leader. They are about the redistribution of power in the global system. And that redistribution is a process that will unfold over years and decades, not over a single negotiation. Now, consider the deeper implication for all of us watching this, because this moment tells us something important about how power works in the modern world. It tells us that unilateral pressure has limits, that resilience in the face of pressure is now more widely distributed than it used to be, that the system is becoming more multipolar in ways that are genuinely changing the options available to even the most powerful actor. And it tells us that negotiation is not the opposite of strength. In a complex world, negotiation is often the expression of sophisticated strategy. Knowing when to apply pressure and knowing when to shift to negotiation is not weakness. It is wisdom. Whether that wisdom will produce outcomes that are truly stable and truly fair is a different question. Because in a world of competing interests and shifting power, stability is never guaranteed. It is always negotiated, always provisional, always subject to revision as conditions change. Now we return to where we began. Trump is suddenly talking about negotiations. And the real reason is not that he has become a different person. It is that the situation has become a different situation. The pressure did not produce quick submission. The costs began to accumulate. The window for favorable deals began to feel like was closing. And the instinct of the deal maker took over. Not to retreat, not to admit failure, but to find the path that still allows him to claim victory while adjusting to a reality that did not cooperate with the original plan. And that is the real story. Not about one man's decision, but about a system that is shifting beneath every decision being made in Washington, in Beijing, in Tehran, and in capitals around the world. A system that is becoming more complex, more multipolar, more resistant to simple domination. And within that system, even the most powerful actors must learn to negotiate with a world that no longer simply follows their lead. And that is where the most important part of this story is still being written. Because these negotiations, whatever they produce in the short term, are not the destination. They are a moment in a much longer transformation. A transformation of how power is organized, how influence is exercised, how decisions are made in a world that is still figuring out what comes after American dominance was at its absolute peak. And the outcomes of that transformation will shape not just the next few years, but the next few decades for every country in the world, including yours, including mine. So watch carefully, because what looks like a simple headline about negotiations is actually a window into something much larger. A world in the process of becoming something new. And we are all living through that becoming right now. Thank you for watching. If this analysis gave you something to think about, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications because these shifts are moving faster now, and the next video may reveal something even more significant about where all of this is heading.